Good morning, or actually good afternoon. It's just turned afternoon on the East Coast. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very pleased to welcome you to another edition of Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, June 24th, 2020. This is our fourth preview session focusing on digital infrastructure investment. That is the theme of our conference on August 10th. And so we've been walking through week by week the different topic areas that we're going to be featuring at the conference. Today, we're speaking about shared infrastructure and how this relates to the 5G build out that we're seeing more about. And we're going to talk about some different aspects, both what the wireless infrastructure industry can teach other aspects of the telecommunication industry, and also some of the lessons that the wireless industry is absorbing and learning from wholesale models. I also wanted to mention just briefly, please feel free to share or like this event. That way others can see us. We're on multiple platforms, and of course, you can also see us at broadbandbreakfast.com, and you can also always tweet questions to us at Broadband Live. So I just want to encourage that up front. And once again, I just want to reiterate, at broadbandbreakfast.com, you can find information about digital infrastructure investment, our August 10th event, and register for that. That'll be a live Zoom conference. And it was to be both a physical and virtual event at Broadband Communities in Houston. Broadband Communities has announced this week that they're going to be all virtual as well. We're sticking with our August 10th date. Encourage you to make time for that on your agenda and to register for an exciting event that we really hope will open up some new observations and insights into the entire digital infrastructure investment ecosystem. With that, I want to open it up to our four different panelists, who I'm going to introduce extremely briefly, and then we'll hear from each of them in turn. First, we'll hear from Mandy Dare. Mandy is a attorney and policy and technology guru at Crown Castle, and he works on all aspects of the infrastructure that Crown Castle is engaged in. And we'll hear from him first, and he can give us a great perspective on how a company that combines tower assets, small cell assets, and fiber assets is approaching shared infrastructure. After Mandy, we'll hear from Oliver Pilko. Oliver is at View Capital Advisors, and he and his company specialize in development, management, and funding of wireless infrastructure assets. So he's very much in this game as well. The tower, in-building wireless, small cell, rooftop picture, and of course, the fiber that's so instrumental in connecting these assets. And then batting cleanup will be Dean Bubley. Dean is the founder of Disruptive Analysis, which is a technology industry analyst and consulting firm. And he's been very prolific in writing about the shared infrastructure model. He hails from over the pond. We've had a number of British people on this series. Dean, you'll be happy to know we had Greg Mesh, the CEO of City Fiber, who spoke with us 2 weeks ago, and he is going to be a keynote speaker at our digital infrastructure investment event on August 10th. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to you, Mandy, to give us a little bit of the lay of the land, the overview, and what an infrastructure asset owner and operator can both teach and learn from this topic area.
Thanks, Drew. It's great to be with you and Dean and Oliver and the rest of the group. I've never been introduced as a technology guru, but I'm going to be using that from now on. My name is, again, Mandy Durr, and I'm Crown Castle's Government Affairs Director for our South area, which covers basically the Gulf Coast states from Texas to Florida. I've been with Crown for about 5.5 years now. Up until about a year ago, I was mainly focused on government affairs work in Texas, but recently that my role's expanded, and I have a team that works on government affairs, relationships, and the work that we do to build small cells, towers, and fiber from Texas to Florida. Just a little bit of background on Crown Castle. we're the nation's largest provider of shared communications infrastructure. So we own and operate 40,000 cell towers nationwide. We have 70,000 small cells that we built or in construction or under contract nationwide. And all of that supported by 80,000 linear miles of fiber throughout the country. So we really have a unique portfolio of both fiber, towers, and small cells that's unmatched in the industry, and really puts us in a unique position to help address any of the connectivity issues that the carriers and other customers have. What we're doing is really building out the nation's 4G and now 5G infrastructure. Our biggest carriers are the major wireless carriers. Our biggest customers are the major wireless carriers. So AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon are by far our biggest customers. And when I mentioned that we're doing shared infrastructure, both the towers, the small cells, and the fiber that we build are designed to host multiple tenants, multiple customers. So as I think most of you know now, many of the cell towers throughout the country all have multiple carriers and other vertical customers on them. And that's true for not only the towers, but the small cells that we're deploying in the public right of way throughout the country, as well as the fiber that we're deploying throughout the country as well. We, in addition to the tower and the small cell business, we have close to 9,000 customers that utilize our fiber assets. They can be, anywhere from state governments to city governments, county governments, who are customers, large medical and hospital systems, school districts, and any other really large enterprise we focus on as one of our potential customers. And we really do have a robust fiber business at this point. We have about 90 offices throughout the country. I'd say we're located in almost every major city, and really the majority of our assets are located in the top 25 markets throughout the country. So that's a little bit of an overview of Crown Castle. Looking forward to the conversation, and I'll turn it back to you, Drew.
Let me ask you just another question to drill in a little bit, Mandy. Could you speak to the history and evolution, if only briefly, of how we got to the circumstance where, at least in the tower business, it's widespread shared infrastructure? What caused, what sort of progression? You see why I'm asking this, right? Because, one of the things we've been talking about at previous events is, why is the wholesale model so slow to catch on in the United States when it's advanced when fiber in the fiber deployment space, where it's been very well acclimatized in other countries, but in the U.S. shared infrastructure, it's the norm now. So how did we get to that point, Mandy, at least in the towers part of the business?
Right. So I should caveat this by saying I've been in the telecom industry for 5.5 years. So a lot of this started happening well before I came on board with Crown Castle. But really the history was, I think really the carriers were really the initial builders of towers throughout the country. And then what we saw was that companies like Crown Castle and American Tower and the companies that came before us really saw the need to use these towers as shared infrastructure. So instead of having 3 towers right next to each other, there was really a cost savings involved, and from a city and municipality and government perspective, an aesthetic driver behind that as well, where you get the cost savings and the aesthetics to build on one tower and host multiple tenants. So I think that's really been the history of this, and we're seeing that in the small cell space as well, where the Crown Castle of the world, and we have some other competitors as well who are who do shared infrastructure on the small cell side, who are building small cells and hosting multiple tenants. So you'll have a Verizon, a T-Mobile, an AT&T on one piece of infrastructure, one pole, let's say. But you also have, since this is really the starting point, the beginning of this major rollout, of small cells and 5G technology, you'll have the wireless carriers themselves self-performing, right? And in some cases deploying their own assets. And the way we view the market is that at some point there's going to be the cost savings, there's going to be the aesthetic desire of communities to really have that shared model on small cells, just as the way it developed on towers as well.
No, that's extremely useful. Thank you for addressing that, and we will of course talk about some of the kind of the cost savings and the logistical issues, and perhaps even zoning and right-of-way issues that come up, and maybe some advantages to shared infrastructure. Well, with that, let's turn to Oliver Pilko for a little bit of a discussion about maybe your vantage point, right? What is it that View Capital sees in this market, and why you've kind of been so focused on it for at least several years that we've been talking. So I'm going to unmute you, Oliver, and go ahead and bring you live. So welcome, Oliver.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Excited to be chatting with everyone here and everyone listening. So View Capital is actually, we run an investment fund, View Wireless Infrastructure, which is independent of the firm, but capitalized by our parent company. We actually explored fiber investments, fiber to the home investments for about a year, kind of exploring that space, seeing if that was a good fit for our clients and investors that we represent. And really, we just weren't sure that the model was there yet. Coming from the telecom side, kind of like Mandy mentioned, I mean, the telco side and tower side, we've always viewed everything as kind of a multi-tenant infrastructure. Very much we treat it as, the phrase vertical real estate. Just as you have an office space, you tend to have multiple tenants. In a multifamily type building, you have multiple tenants. It's a model that's proven that's worked very well, provides a diversified risk basis for investors, and really provides opportunity for different carriers and choices for all the end users that are paying for the service. So it's a model that's proven very successful in other asset classes that are related to towers and small cell and wireless. The fiber wasn't quite there yet. The private-public partnership, it was still too early on. We wanted the dust to settle, so we refocused back on wireless. And our main focus today is greenfield developments for tower sides, a lot of in-building wireless solutions. That has obviously been one of the legacy assets that's been big in our portfolio. But, obviously that's changing. We're seeing private LTE systems being deployed. We're seeing property owners seeing the value in being able to provide good connectivity within a building, whether it's office space, whether it's industrial, whether it's healthcare. They're kind of jumping ahead of where the carriers' budgets are able to allow them to deploy their technology and their services, and providing it themselves where it's really necessary. So it's been exciting, but we've always viewed the world as a multi-tenant kind of environment. It's great that I think this is catching on and viewed as a more standard alternative to just building fiber everywhere. In some cases, I think it's not particularly cost effective. In certain areas, it is. But I think the more tools that you have available to you, the more successful you can be in providing connectivity for everyone that needs it.
So Oliver, two things you said there I want to focus in on. The first was you looked at fiber. That's of course initially where we started talking, and you said, well, we're going to take a pass on this. But what you did, you dived into this segment, right? The vertical real estate segment. What was it about the vertical real estate that was more ready for the type of kind of digital REIT model that you and Crown Castle and others are involved in, and kind of why fiber wasn't ready yet? Do you see any changes in that thus far?
Well, Crown Castle is one of the 800-pound gorillas in the industry, and they obviously set a very high standard in how to operate and execute. So we're very fortunate to have them as we're an independent developer. We're not very big. We're obviously a fair number of other developers out there that work in more tertiary markets, outside of your core plus. We're kind of on the cutting edge, bleeding edge of where we see demographic changes. we see adaptive reuse. We see the best land use kind of being modified as the population continues to grow or modify in certain markets. But from our perspective, we represent a lot of retail investors. Folks like yourself, myself, not particularly institutional size investors that have viewed the landscape through a more traditional real estate lens. They're viewing it as from a risk perspective. If you have just one city or one entity using fiber, we've seen some instances where cities have defaulted, filed bankruptcy. It's a phenomenon that's very rare, but it kind of sits heavy on everyone's mind. Being cognizant of that, you do want to spread out your risk. And so at that point, fiber just was very much driven by a more of a retail model, which is a different type of game for investors who are very much used to a more passive type of investment with real estate. So it didn't fit in our box as well as we would have liked. The returns weren't particularly attractive, and we had to look elsewhere to see where the opportunities were. But I think the biggest hurdle for us was the timing and being able to put capital to work. There's obviously a lot of capital out there that could help accelerate connectivity throughout the country. It's just finding the model that works for both investors and for communities. And the timing really became a difficult thing for us. As I'm sure as Mandy has experienced, working with the jurisdiction and local government, it's a longer process. There's a lot of hands you need to shake. There's a lot of voices that need to be heard. And it's absolutely necessary, but it's also, it takes a certain amount of time to get through that and have the dust settle before you can really have an executed game plan. So, in line with what the carriers are looking for, speed of deployment, we refocus back to more wireless dedicated infrastructure.
No, thanks for addressing that. And it just very quickly so that we can get to Dean. We at Broadband Breakfast talk not just about the higher capacity fiber and wireless and what it takes to get the infrastructure, but the applications and uses. And so we're always wanting to just translate this. So you referred to DAS, of course, distributed antenna systems. Could you just speak about, from your perspective, Oliver, how do you view the progression for 4G LTE, DAS? You mentioned private LTE. Could you just speak very, very briefly to the role of these technologies and how they play into the vertical real estate?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different solutions for different situations. Again, it's very much budget driven. It's very dependent on the type of property you're working in, potential impacts, the physical structure itself, and what the carriers have available in regards to spectrum in those markets. CBRS is kind of has reached a critical point, I think, where it could really change how we deploy and building wireless. But I think at the end of the day, the technology will continue to change and improve, providing better capacity, better coverage, and that's kind of the benefit of working with a third-party infrastructure provider like Crown Castle, or like ourselves to a smaller scale. Is we're providing the capital and expertise to continually upgrade and update that technology along with the carriers, and I think that's something that, having that expertise and having the capital to do that without having to go to constituents and raise taxes along those lines really provides at this point, I think probably one of the best solutions out there today.
Well, awesome. And of course, you referred to CBRS, which stands for Citizens Broadband Radio Service, and that is the subject of a FCC auction that's scheduled to happen next month. And I know Dean has also spoken about this, addressed this. Let me go ahead and turn it to you, Dean. What are some of the thoughts you have on this infrastructure we're speaking about, the shared infrastructure, and maybe some insights from the UK perspective?
Sure. I cover UK as well as, pretty much global markets. And I've been spending a lot of time over the last couple of years looking at shared infrastructure. But to be honest, that's a subset of shared everything in telecommunications. So whether it's shared cellular infrastructure like towers and small cells, whether it's the fiber, whether it's the cloud and also increasingly edge compute locations, indoor systems, but also this needs to be viewed through the lens of what else is going on. So the most important things what you just mentioned, CBRS, and that's shared spectrum. And shared spectrum is emerging in all sorts of varieties around the world. Slightly different schemes in the US, UK, Japan, Germany, France, Malaysia, and elsewhere. Which part of the spectrum, how large the geographic areas are, what the rules are, what the powers are. But that is a fundamental driver for a lot of business models that are emerging around private 5G and private LTE, neutral host, which is a wholesale model, particularly as a wholesale model where the service provider has either its own spectrum or it's at least providing part of the active network. You're also getting multi-tenancy and shared infrastructure on the shared software for things like multi-tenant core networks. Really interesting one at the moment. A huge amount around RAN virtualization and Open RAN, so that the traditional way of building cellular networks, where you maybe go to Ericsson or Huawei or Nokia, one of these large companies, to buy your entire radio network, that's now starting to get broken up, partly because of software and technology, and partly because of some geopolitical issues around Huawei in particular. And so that allows all sorts of new shared models where perhaps one company owns the front half of the radio infrastructure and carriers. The wholesale proposition is almost like putting a software baseband driving a common radio head. Now, it depends there on spectrum capabilities, and there's a whole bunch of questions about whether you can do some of the fancy 5G features all the way through that type of wholesale network. And so I'm spending a lot of time looking at the business models that emerge, particularly on the cellular neutral host side. And there I see, depending where you look around the world, the wholesale models are, some of them are indoors, and that's an evolution of the neutral host DAS model towards small cells and 5G. But I'm also seeing, I had a call earlier today about neutral host for rural coverage, where, for example, the idea is that a village community puts up its own cell tower if it's got no coverage off the main carrier networks, and then allows either a roaming model or a shared small cell, interconnected core networks in that locality. And there could be an aggregation tier on top of that as well. Industrial and private 4G and 5G networks are interesting because if you're, let's say, an auto manufacturer and you build a private network for your robots and your production automation equipment, potentially, again, you might then allow the national cell carriers to roam inside of your factory if their existing coverage isn't good enough. Now, there's a whole bunch of contractual questions and a whole bunch of legal issues around everything from lawful intercept to liability and so on. I'm seeing in some countries interest in doing wholesale networks run by road agencies or highway agencies or railway companies where they have their own connectivity requirements, but they have both fiber and perhaps 5G, perhaps even millimeter wave 5G along the trackside, which could be used as a wholesale platform. Metropolitan densification, where it might be a local authority decides to monetize its street furniture like lamp poles or other things on the traffic lights or anywhere else you could mount a small cell or perhaps a 5G millimeter wave relay. In some countries, organizations like local authorities have access to spectrum in their own right. And it's still early days for some of that. And then you've got other national wholesale networks that are being built out in Mexico has one, South Africa's got one. I know that Dense Air, which is a service provider arm of Airspan, has spectrum in New Zealand, Belgium, Portugal, a couple of other places, Ireland, I think. And so there's all these different models. Obviously, with CBRS in the US, that's certainly going to be an important part here, whether that is for indoor or perhaps for metro coverage. But the difficulty here often is the contractual arrangements between existing telecom service providers who perhaps aren't always very open to dealing with small new entrants who they see as sort of perhaps disrupting them from adjacency, or maybe they have security and performance concerns. How much visibility do they have if their customers are using someone else's assets? and there's the range of stakeholders that are becoming present. As I say, it could be everyone from the tower companies to the indoor providers to municipal authorities to startups that are just focused on this opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a few years for it all to shake out, in my view.
Well, excellent additional laying of the table, and particularly with the global perspective, I would really like to get Mandy's thoughts on the things that Oliver and particularly Dean has just laid out. In particularly some of the interesting distinctions between, you know, a rural versus a densification versus industrial, and even the roads where you have a kind of a national potential model. What are some of the things you've seen, Mandy, in the United States in terms of divergences in use of the shared infrastructure? And I'll make sure to unmute you here, Mandy, so you can respond to this here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way Dean just described it is, you know, what we've been seeing dealing with our customers and the way we are looking at this, right? And Oliver touched on this as well, right? We've been deploying, you know, both ODAS and IDAS. We've worked with for years now, right? We've worked with, you know, large universities where we're building out, you know, dorm rooms and the entire campus with small cells, as well as the football stadium at many universities throughout the country. We're working with, you know, building owners where we're looking at CBRS and private LTE as well. So, you know, I think the way Dean and Oliver described it, and the way Dean described it in terms of, you know, what's happening internationally is similar to what's happening in the U.S. as well, and we've been in that market and exploring, you know, those type of solutions for years now.
Let me just specifically address the question about, let's say you're a rural community and you're not getting the coverage you want. What's Crown Castle's take on what Dean described, where a rural community kind of puts its own tower up and allows people to launch on it? I also love, Oliver, your perspective on that too.
Yeah, so I mean, the good news, I think, or one of the pieces of good news that we've seen developing through the years, and it's been exacerbated obviously even more with COVID-19, is that there's really been a focus on making sure that rural communities, you know, have the connectivity that they need. And so, you know, we've been seeing throughout the country, both state governments and the federal government taking really decisive steps and funding in order to get broadband access out to these rural communities. So I don't think, you know, the beginning of all these rollouts, you see, you know, for a long time now, whether it was, you know, going back to 3G and then 4G and the beginnings of 5G, is going to be focused on initially on, you know, where the most devices are, and, you know, where you need that additional coverage and capacity. But as we roll out more, and we've seen this historically, it's going to expand into, you know, first suburbs outside of, you know, very dense urban areas, and then to the rural areas. And like I just mentioned, you know, we're seeing a lot of funding coming in, which is going to support a lot of that connectivity in rural areas.
Oliver, do you want to address this too?
Sure. I think Mandy hit kind of the nail on the head there, where it's traditionally been driven by, you know, where the capacity is required, and that's, you know, we take a lot of our direction from the carriers. They obviously have, you know, fantastic RF engineers. They have they're staffed up. They really do a great job in addressing that. You know, we're right now in the process of developing our case study. We've kind of studied a few smaller towns, more rural communities that have done somewhat unique partnerships with some of the carriers. You know, whether it's buying direct bulk services through the carriers or buying direct internet connectivity through their own budgets, and trying to deploy that themselves. You know, we're kind of in the middle of that. We think it's an interesting solution. You know, where we fit in is we could kind of offset that upfront capital cost in building you know, placing the sites, buying the equipment, you know, doing some type of equipment financing, very similar to an indoor, you know, deployment. it's just a modified ODAS from our point of view when you look at the numbers. But we have seen some.
Just explain that. We really want to make sure not to lapse into jargon. The modified ODAS. Just walk us through what that means, Oliver.
Well, it's interesting because there's a town. We're obviously under a limited ability to express too many details, but they bought bulk internet service. Obviously, microwave technology is tested. It's proven. The idea there is to use a kind of daisy chain of series of microwaves to bring connectivity to the town. From there, we deploy it via traditional tower, rooftop antennas. The city is actually paying for the internet service themselves. It's kind of a service that they're providing, but it provides an end solution to their constituents and everyone in the town to have access to some internet, at least a basic type of internet and connectivity. So the bottom line is, I think there's a lot of creativity out there. There's obviously enough advanced equipment that can be leveraged today, and it's really just finding a structure contractually that works for a rural town that may have the budget, may not have the budget, and kind of go from there. Otherwise, I think it's as Mandy mentioned, and I think there's been a big focus on providing rural communities the budgets that they need. I think we'll get there sooner than later at this point.
Let me turn to Dean for a second and come back to the biggest picture trends here. And putting CBRS opportunity aside, what are some differences, if any, you've noticed between U.S. Shared infrastructure market and those in other parts of the world? And I'll make.
I think probably the thing that I don't see as much of in the US is sharing between the carriers directly rather than via a third party like a tower company. In Europe in particular, and also China and a few other countries, it's quite common for groups of 2 or 3 of the carriers to share part of their radio networks and their infrastructure, irrespective of the open tower market. So in the UK, there's 4 network operators, and they've paired up as 2 groups of 2 with 2 joint ventures to run a lot of their infrastructure. Now, they'll still use third-party towers, and what they tend to do is they'll use the shared network for the bulk of their sites, and then they'll add additional ones on as needed. And I think something similar is happening in China, in the Nordics. I think at least 2 of the countries in the Nordics, Sweden, I think, and Norway have that model. I was reading something about Netherlands, a number of others, and that is continuing to evolve with 5G compared to where we were with 4G. And so I think that's perhaps something to keep an eye on. And then the other ones you have is involvement of government in some places, either at a national level, where I believe in Mexico and Rwanda in Africa, there are government-sponsored national wholesale networks, which I know at one point someone was rumored in the US that the White House had been looking at. There's sort of variations on that. So again, in the UK, for the rural side of things, there's a like public-private partnership called the Rural Shared Network Initiative, which just started, where the 4 network operators have put in a certain amount of money, and it's been matched funds from the Department for, the Telecoms Ministry, it's called it, in the UK, to build out additional cell sites. So that, again, doesn't have the third parties necessarily, or they might be involved with the construction and maintenance. But that's actually used the existing incumbents working together rather than with a tower company. And I think that's something which happens, and you might see that at a micro level with municipalities. You certainly get that with fiber. And so that would be the variable that I think is worth noting around the world. And yeah, I don't know if anyone's actually worked out what the various policies are in the US post November and the election as to whether that might change or not. But if I look around the world, shared infrastructure you have for fixed networks in places like Australia and Singapore. So it's not an unusual model, and it's getting further along that path in some places.
Well, and you know, this is another piece that we've addressed and will address it on the August 10th event. We addressed it last week. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is a piece of new funding for rural. It doesn't address the shared infrastructure piece because it's you know, funding for particular provider, but certainly goes to this issue of getting more rural connectivity. I want to turn to Mandy and ask about what were the trends we're going to see. You highlighted the 40,000 towers, 70,000 small cells, and 80,000 linear miles of fiber. So I take it that you're expecting the small cell one to grow more than the tower one. Could you just speak to how you see the shared infrastructure model evolving as we move towards the necessity of having transceivers deeper and deeper into neighborhoods? I'll go ahead and unmute you here, Mandy, so you can address that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, focusing on small cells is a good example of this, right? So what we're going to see and what we are seeing now is with 5G coming along and the amount of data that folks are currently consuming, you need the antennas and the radios closer to the end user, right? So this is going to be especially true with 5G, where there's going to be millions and millions of more connected devices, right? Your shirt's going to have a chip on it, right? Autonomous vehicles, right? Your shoes are going to have chips. So there's the amount of data that's going to be collected is already exponential. I mean, it's growing exponentially year over year, and it'll continue to do that. So what you're going to see is the need for more and more small cells, right? And the model that best suits that is really a shared infrastructure model, right? Where companies like Crown Castle, we're able to have multiple carriers, you know, and maybe it's not even just carriers in the future, right? We could have multiple other customers located on our infrastructure in the right of way, all connected by fiber, and we're expected to see that, you know, just grow exponentially for the foreseeable future.
We have a great question here from Sean McLaughlin that I want to pose to all three of our panelists. Upsides to public muni tower development with space to share and interconnect, as well as co-locate. Building off a couple of comments that have been made, particularly Dean, your comments there. Why don't we take it in reverse order? Dean, Oliver, and Mandy. What would you say to Sean on that point?
Well, there is some interest in edge computing now. Whether you would have an edge data center at a tower site, I think it depends a little bit on where you are and a bunch of other factors around the nearest data centers and so on. So that's one side of this, but I think there's a bit too much hype about some of the mech style of edge computing. Where it perhaps gets more interesting is where you do have perhaps a future Open RAN model, where you've got perhaps some form of shared infrastructure, but you need to host the baseband equipment. You know, that's a possibility. And I think the other interesting thing is what does the future of interconnect look like, both for connections between carriers, but also whether we start to see some sort of distributed, you know, edge IXP model. You know, because I mean, yeah, at the moment, particularly on cellular, if you want to, if I'm playing a game with the other people on this call, you end up going all the way to the back of the network to interconnect. So you might have an edge resource on one network, but where's the interconnect point with the cloud and all the other endpoints? And so you might see those get pushed further out, although whether it's going to be down to a sort of municipality level, I'm not so sure.
Thanks. Oliver, what's your reaction to these thoughts?
I mean, I think it's great. I mean, we kind of see those types of partnerships already being developed. I mean, when you build a cell tower, one of our preferred areas is building on city or county land and working directly with them. So I think that's been going on for years. It's really more so on the side of, you know, the local jurisdiction or county to want to work with us and being open to that and supporting us. More importantly, when it comes to getting permits and being able to construct, I think that's where we really needed their support in a partnership. more so than anything. But you know, from that perspective, a lot of times, you know, it's simple enough. In a tower build, we provide municipalities the opportunity to load their equipment on a tower already. I mean, the footprint is designed big enough for multiple tenants on the real estate side. So it's, you know, it's something that exists today. Can that be further developed? Absolutely. But I think where we need the most support is getting the ability to continue building where it's required, and having that support from those partnerships. That's what we need. I mean, if it's taking us, we just finished building a site that had been trying to be built for almost 18 years. And it so happened that we just had the support of the city council that we were working with. The building permit was finally issued. You know, we worked hand in hand with them. It took us 3 years to get that through. So it's great. It's exciting, but you know, that's really where the partnership value is driven on our end.
Mandy, your reactions?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Oliver just said. You know, we view ourselves as the last owner of the asset, right? And when we go into a community, we're looking to partner with that community and that local government, right? And you know, it's absolutely critical, since we're going to have that asset there for, you know, decades, right? That we develop a good relationship with the local community, and that's what we endeavor to do and do, whether it's tower, small cell, or even, you know, fiber construction. And so I would echo exactly what Oliver just said.
Let's probe a little bit further on this issue of the scale of deployment and how much we're going to need. You know, we've been doing this webcast for 3 months now, and we started because of the constraints of the coronavirus, right? We started because we needed to kind of connect and share and discuss solutions and how broadband is a solution to the problems we're experiencing. And what we've heard is that ISPs are doing more business than ever. There's more capacity being used. There's more strain in some cases, but there's also more subscriptions, right? And not that everything's good, right? I mean, there's always the question of, you know, are customers going to be able to pay for their networks, and that's an ever-present question too. But in terms of the need that broadband brings, it's crucial, and we recognize that. And so, how much more need will there be? And again, I come back to the 40,000 towers you have and the 70,000 small cells. I take it you're anticipating that small cell number to have to grow, right? Mandy, could you just talk about growth and how you manage that, and how you kind of prepare the cities and others to say, hey, we've got a lot of construction we need to do here. This is how it can be done in the best way. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mandy? And I'd love Dean and Oliver to weigh in too.
Yeah, so we're expecting, you know, all of our lines of business to grow, you know, exponentially, and we think we're suited, you know, perfectly to be able to do that, right? I think, you know, another thing to come out of this COVID-19 situation is that cities and governments have realized, and you know, it's published by the federal government, that this communications infrastructure is essential, critical infrastructure. So, you know, where we might have had a situation where there hasn't been as much focus, even though we've tried to do it, on the importance of getting more infrastructure built for communications. Now the cities, I think, really have a better understanding. Cities and states and county governments have a better understanding of just how critical this is when you have the country, you know, having to do distance learning, the kids doing distance learning, and you know, a lot of folks working from home, obviously. So, you know, we are going to see the demand continue to grow. We don't see any slowdown at all. And in fact, you know, over the past 3.5, 4 months, in many cases, we've seen even more cooperation from local governments, allowing us to be able to deploy, because they are now really understanding how critical this infrastructure is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the data center industry is doing pretty well at the moment, but also I'm seeing governments becoming much more pragmatic about planning regulations, permits to dig up the road, all of the sort of bits and pieces. Now, assuming that the city hall is actually open and you can go and get the permits, or they're able to work from home, but at least in principle. And I think also then there's the sort of double-edged sword of the coming likely recession. I saw the IMF put forecasts out today, which are pretty ugly around the world. And what you're going to get there is obviously there's a certain amount of exposure because there will be some end users going, enterprise end users going out of business. There will be a lot of people, consumers who are cash strapped. But at the same time, you will also see governments look at infrastructure projects as a way to stimulate economies, and I think that the telecoms infrastructure side of things has both the direct effect of essentially just sort of creating infrastructure is often from a Keynesian point of view seen as a good thing, and then you also have the add-ons to economy, which is going to have to be a bit more agile and flexible. The term I've heard described about for enterprise in the future is being able to deal with just in case rather than just in time. Everyone's going to need to have a plan B. You're going to need to have what happens if you have to go back to quarantine and lockdown in the winter. Do we have to deal with more outdoor coverage as well as indoor if you're wireless, because you've got a tent in front of the hospital, which in the past it was just a building, or maybe you've got disinfecting robots in your smart city. I don't know. We don't know. Right. And you can put out all these scenarios, but what you will need is more connectivity and more flexibility in how to scale it up, scale it down. What you've seen at the moment is, say, for fixed broadband traffic in most places has gone up, although it's gone up during the quiet periods during the day, and actually the peak hasn't changed that much. Mobile traffic has been flat, slightly up or down. But the interesting thing there is it's moved. It's gone from urban centres and railways and sports stadiums out to suburbs. And that's put load on the towers. It's put load on the backhaul. And so, again, we don't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, another kind of witty comment there from Sean about the cloud being the ground, fog. I want to just get a little bit more from the perspective Oliver raised a little bit earlier about municipalities and kind of you just want them to get out of the way. To kind of summarize a bit crudely, Oliver, what you said. Is that the end of the story, right? I mean, Dean and Mandy and Oliver as well. Are there ways that, because cities are actively talking about ways they can be involved in last mile deployments, for example, right? And that may be more on the fiber side of the equation, but just, and to the point that Sean has been making here on these comments, cities do benefit from the shared infrastructure, obviously, because there's less need to build infrastructure. Mandy, this is something you've talked quite a bit about. I just want to kind of explore this a little bit further and see if there are needs that the cities and municipalities, counties have that could be served by shared infrastructure that are not currently being met.
I mean, just to kind of jump in, I think absolutely. I mean, when we initially looked at fiber builds as kind of the core investment thesis when we launched View Wireless Infrastructure, there was definitely a siloing or segmentation of different political aspects. You had telemedicine, you had education, each kind of group getting separate funding, building out their own dedicated fiber network. It kind of became this kind of cloudy, misunderstood area for us as a third party investor to come in. They wanted connectivity for everyone, but they also had already built out a fiber network. We can't really, we represent investors, people who work very hard their entire life to try to find some passive income, and to go out and redeploy capital where there's already existing infrastructure that's dedicated to another particular group just didn't make a lot of sense to us. So I think there's a lot of legacy assets that exist out there that, it would make sense for a municipality to partner with a third party to leverage that. One, it creates revenue for themselves, but it also really leverages legacy assets that exist today that can be interconnected or tied in with new infrastructure that can be funded separate from taxpayers, from very willing investors, to really provide the coverage that you need. I just think there needs to be a more conducive plan working with everyone else that is working ultimately to the same goal.
Mander, Dean, anything further on that point you'd like to address, or on the deployment of the shared infrastructure in a context that helps municipalities the most?
I mean, I think Oliver touched on it, right? I mean, there's always an interest in shared fiber, obviously. What we're seeing a lot of today is some of these smart city, applications, which is obviously an incredibly broad term that could encompass a whole number of things. But whether it's a city wanting to attach gunshot detection devices, or public safety cameras on our small cell right-of-way poles. There's ways that we work very closely with these cities and partner with them. That's beneficial for us, for the cities, for the community, and we're always open to those discussions, and we're doing it in many cities throughout the country.
Right. I also want to bring in some of the point that was made about. Let's talk a little bit about some of the unique things that investors and others have been deploying. Like, for example, could you talk a little bit about in-building wireless, Oliver, and what it is that is done to a shared infrastructure? What might be different about the way a building owner, multi-tenant building owner, makes use of infrastructure to enhance coverage in a particular area? Could you speak to that a little bit, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, initially, over the last decade, it was very much driven by the carriers' demand. I mean, you started off with stadiums, venues, that campuses, as Mandy mentioned. I mean, those are easy hotspots that have been identified, that there's just so much foot traffic, and obviously as the demographics kind of point to it, you look at the CTIA data, the age group that's using the most data has multiple devices. It kind of became a very clear picture to everyone where we needed additional coverage. In some cases, very situational, like a venue. But it's continued to evolve. I mean, we're starting to see, I would say 5 years ago, we've had a series of studies from a lot of groups, some of the bigger brokerages and real estate investments, trusts. They started seeing the value in having good connectivity inside an office building, inside multifamily. It's very much a bottom line driven investment for them, but they also understand that they lack the expertise to execute that properly. So they started seeking out partnerships. I mean, it's evolved to a point now where you see groups like CBRE trying to enter the space. We have a lot of I'm sure shared contacts that we know that have kind of helped them launch that, and other real estate groups as well. So it's become to a point where you're seeing these private networks being developed, and where Wi-Fi really isn't the end all be all anymore. You need something more robust, something that's scalable, something that could potentially be taken over, or a carrier could step in and continue to manage down the line. So, there's an evolution that's happening. I think a lot of property owners are outpacing where the carriers are today, just based on necessity. But there could be a merger there of that infrastructure at some point, and it could very well happen sooner than later. But it's addressing a need there today, and it's adding to their bottom line of value to their properties.
And is the in-building component shared as well, or is there a kind of a more focused carrier-specific deployment on those in-buildings?
I think generally, from our point of view, you want it to be shared. People use T-Mobile, people use Verizon, people use AT&T, people use Spectrum, which is kind of piggybacked off other networks as an MVNO. So being able to provide coverage for multiple carriers, I think, is critical, and it's critical for the experience of the end user. So, we've come across situations where there's legacy equipment, inside a building that was exclusive to one carrier. And I think property owners are starting to understand that, you got to give everyone a fair shot. If the carrier's not interested in that, well, maybe it's on their budget. It's not a core issue for them today, but presenting that opportunity and having that kind of open type usage of that network is important especially for the end user, which is everyone's end client at the end of the day.
Mandy?
That gets more complex in the 5G era, though, because the spectrum policies for each of the carriers is very different. Although everyone's probably going to end up with low band, mid band, high band, not all of the infrastructure is going to support all of the bands. And then as soon as you start trying to lay on top of that any of the cooler promised 5G visions, probably 2 to 4 years out, are you really going to be able to deliver, ultra reliable, low latency, end-to-end network slicing and all that jazz over someone else's infrastructure? And can you do that for all the carriers? So, imagine that the elevator engineer comes in with their AR headset and they're inside the elevator shaft. Whose problem is it? Who's when they have an end-to-end quality of service guarantee for that? Who owns that liability?
Mandy, I'd love your reaction to that question and the additional question of, as we get to the CBRS space, right? How does a new entrant say, "Hey, you've got shared infrastructure. I'd like to enter into an ability to provide service through that shared infrastructure"? Could you speak to both those questions, Mandy?
Yeah, and I mean, I think from our perspective, we think we're, uniquely positioned to deal with those issues. We're obviously working very closely with the carriers, the manufacturers, and we think that there's going to be, a very viable path forward to deal with those issues. In terms of CBRS, that's something that we've been looking at for some time now, and we're still obviously in the very 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 early phases of seeing how that's all gonna shake out. But we do see a way forward and lots of different options that are going to come from the CBRS.
All right. Sorry, we're almost. Let me just mute for a second here. We're almost at the end of our hour here, and I want to kind of pull back to the very beginning, both to highlight the ongoing discussion that we'll be having at Digital Infrastructure Investment on August 10th, but also to sort of, Dean kind of helped us out in your remarks here. Shared infrastructure is a part of shared everything. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that, Dean, in closing, and offer some final comments about where you see the future of shared infrastructure, not just in the vertical real estate space, but in the broader ecosystem? And really, if all of you could kind of address that question, Dean and Oliver and Mandy, to out, we'd be grateful before we close out on this topic and this theme that we've been doing.
I see it in a way as a paradox. At one level, it's going to be easier and more important for companies to build wholesale models at everything from the physical assets to the software, to the APIs, to the billing system, to the numbering, and so on. And there's going to be wholesale models at each of those tiers, where service providers can be both buyers and sellers. But on the other side, the software that allows this also democratizes the network, so it becomes easier for people to build their own private custom mobile network, fiber network, whatever. And so you've got this sort of tension between the democratized, I'll build it myself, and the wholesale, I'll buy it from someone. And I don't think there's going to be it's not going to shift one way or the other. It's going to go both to both ends of that continuum.
Well, excellent thoughts there. Thank you, Dean, for being with us and sharing that. Oliver, let's turn to you for a moment of where you see the future of shared infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an exciting time. I think as we're rolling out new technology, equipment gets better. I don't really see it slowing down. I think it's kind of an American institution to have competitive services being offered. I think it benefits everyone. It's kind of been the ultimate goal, and I think we have some great companies trying to provide great service. And we just see we kind of take our points of view from where the carriers want to go and where the demand is today. They're driving the show, and if a municipality or government entity wants to step in and provide service, I mean, we're happy to work with them. Ultimately, we just see as we're all doing the best we can to provide connectivity to everyone and everywhere that requires it. I think it's definitely, I have young kids. I think it's the future, and this is critical infrastructure that we need to remain competitive throughout the world, to improve technology, to improve people's lives, and ultimately that's why we stay in this business.
Well, very good, very good. Thank you, Oliver, for being with us and sharing your thoughts. And we'll kind of turn to final words to Mandy and where you see shared infrastructure going and the role Crown Castle plays in that.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but we see the demand. We're suited to be able to meet that demand with our unique portfolio of fiber, small cells, and towers. We're just very excited to be in the space, and think there's really great times ahead.
Well, we haven't talked perhaps as much as we might have about the role that fiber plays in stitching that together, right? And that is something we have talked both 3 weeks ago and 2 weeks ago when we discussed last mile infrastructure and the investment angle, and we'll certainly be addressing in greater detail on August 10th. I want to thank again each of our guests, Mandy and Oliver and Dean, for being with us for this discussion of shared infrastructure. Invite you to go to Broadband Breakfast and register for digital infrastructure investment on August 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And also encourage you to come back again next week to Broadband Breakfast Live Online, where we'll continue our discussion of broadband's role that it plays in addressing the issues raised by the coronavirus and our society right now. Thank you again. See you next Wednesday.